Ice by Ice-T and Douglas Century. Continued. Disc 4. There was something in the ether in 1987. About the same time we put out Rhyme Pays, Eric B. and Rakim put out their debut record, Paid in Full. Now, Paid in Full is a classic, but if you listen to the content, it's not that gangster, not in terms of the lyrics. But they repped that look, with the big gold chains, repping that hustler look. Rakim's voice sounded so hard without even cursing or getting too graphic. I think the hardest thing Rakim ever said in any of his records was, "I used to roll up. This is a hold up. Ain't nothing funny. Stop smiling. Be still. Don't nothing move but the money." That was his little poetic window into being a stick-up kid. He didn't harp on it. He just made that little allusion. But I was the polar opposite. I wasn't alluding to shit. I harped on the criminal exploits. That's where I came from in reality, and that's what I expected my music and my performances to reflect. But I was definitely pushing the envelope, especially for a major label like Sire. I remember one day when Seymour Stein called me up, sounding kind of perturbed. He said he wanted to talk to me about one of my lyrics. I knew exactly what he was going to say. See, I had a song called 409 on Rhyme Pays with a lyric that went, "Guys grab a girl, girls grab a guy. If a guy wants a guy, please take it outside." Seymour quoted that line to me. "Ice," he said, "come on. What's that?" "Seymour," I said, "look, I'm straight. Now if I wanted to get on the record and say, 'Guys grab a guy,' that would be okay? It would be cool to say I'm gay on a record, but I can't say I'm straight? I'm not saying to go bash no one. I'm just saying, personally, I don't want to see it." He kept giving me static, saying that journalists and critics would see it as an anti-gay statement, that I'd alienate some potential fans. So I flipped the script on him. "What do you think of the record?" I said. "Well, to be honest, I'm feeling a lot of tension." "What does your daughter think of the record?" "She loves it." "You know that tension you're feeling, Seymour? That tension is probably money." And then we hung up. That was the deal with Seymour. He wasn't going to edit nothing. That wasn't his deal. He'd speak his mind. He'd show his concern. But he wouldn't try to control me. We had records like Sex, and that song was super edgy back in the late 80s. Hip-hop hadn't gotten nearly as graphic and X-rated as it did 10 years later. It was great chemistry. Seymour supported us business-wise, but he didn't meddle in the creative side of what we were doing. And we delivered the goods. We put out a string of albums for Warner Brothers. Rhyme Pays, then Power, Freedom of Speech, Original Gangster. All of them certified gold records. I was like the king of the world over there at Warner Brothers. Of the black artists, the only one who was selling more than me was Prince. As far as the hip-hop went, I was over there pretty much alone. And then Cold Chillin' Records came over to the Warner umbrella. Cold Chillin' had Big Daddy Kane, and that's when me and Kane started going out and doing promotional tours. And eventually, Uptown Records came over there as well. I hadn't met Puffy yet. But just like the famous story goes, he was this young, hustling kid running around as a mail clerk for Andre Harrell back then. Benny Medina was my go-to guy at Warner. So Andre was the boss at Uptown, and Puffy was working for him. And it was Benny who'd signed Andre to Warner. But a little later it all flipped. Puffy became the man, and Benny transitioned into J-Lo's manager. It was crazy, but that's the music industry for you. I've had years in the music biz to observe this. Don't get too hung up on working with any one person, because it's like a game of checkers, where dudes are hopping over one another all the time, shouting, "King me, motherfucker." It's checkers, yo, but with a lot of money at stake. We had some crazy times in those early days of my rap career. It was a glamorous time. Pretty much the first thing on my agenda was indulging my taste for expensive cars. I had one of the first Ferraris to hit the scene. It was a candy apple red Ferrari Mondial convertible. Just gorgeous. I was one of the first cats to drive that exotic shit. Motherfuckers were still lowriding in L.A. Now, I've got to explain something about Flavor Flav. By the time Public Enemy came out, Flav and I were tight. He'd come see me whenever he was on the West Coast, and we'd hang out. I was like his surrogate Chuck D. He'd listen to Chuck D when he was in the East, and he respected me like I was a West Coast Chuck D. This one afternoon, Flav showed up at my house in Hollywood, out of control, with those fucking antlers on, honking his car horn, in L.A. Flav is not an act. That nigga's crazy. Hanging out with Flav is a wild adventure. He'll be rolling, stop his car in the middle of an intersection, jump out, and fix his pants and shit while a bunch of cars are honking. Every time he stops the car, there's drama. I always say Flavor is a walking event. He dropped by my house and we decided to roll to Red Lobster. We took 2 cars. I was in my new Ferrari. Flav and Terminator X were following us in a rented Mustang. I pulled into this parking structure. I could see in the rearview mirror that Flavor was screaming and waving his arms and doing what he always does. And then the fool smashed right into the back of my brand new Ferrari. We all heard the brake light shatter. It got really quiet, and then Terminator X said, "Oh shit, you just wrecked Ice's ride." All he really did was bust the brake light. He didn't do any structural damage, didn't bend the car. Still, it looked bad. Flavor gets out of the rental car, and for 1 minute, he's transformed back into William Drayton. He's no longer crazy-ass Flavor Flav. He's talking to me like an attorney, in his real voice. "Ice, I am really sorry for this mishap." None of that, "yeah, boy," shit. He took a little piece of the brake light, and word is bond. He probably still has that shit in his wallet. He carried that brake light for years. Every time I'd see him in L.A., New York, anywhere, he'd open his wallet and show it to me. And he'd tell everyone within earshot, that day was the closest I ever came to death. I really thought Ice was going to kill me for cracking his Ferrari. I had a song on Rhyme Pays called Squeeze the Trigger. And when Dennis Hopper, rest in peace, was finishing up his film Colors, which he directed, I got word that they wanted to use Squeeze the Trigger in the movie. I said, "That's cool. Can I see the movie first?" It was still a rough cut, no score or soundtrack yet, and the producers set up a screening for us. Dennis showed me the scene where Don Cheadle's character, Rocket, is listening to music, which is where they wanted to put the song. The movie was nearly finished, and I asked, "Hey, do you have a title song yet?" They said yes. They had a song by Rick James called Colors. It was a funky beat, but it was Rick James wailing, "Look at all these colors," sounding. Well, exactly like Super Freak Rick James. I knew if they used that Rick James song, it was going to sound corny as hell, especially in a film about gangbanging. They needed something hard. They needed a song that was authentic to the L.A. gangbanging world. "Nah, man," I said. "Let me hook up a new title song for this piece." So I went off to write Colors. Now, there was a song out by King's son called Mythological. I thought the song was dope, and decided I'd use it as a kind of format for Colors. Islam had this little bass line sample in his rolling machine. We used the beat from Mythological, and I did my own variation of King's son's flow. I am a nightmare walking, psychopath talking, king of the jungle, just a gangster stalking. I rocked a gangster story to the cadence of Mythological. It was a first-person gangbanging story with the line most people remember. The gangs of L.A. will never die, just multiply. A lot of hip-hop records are made that way, building on what other brothers are putting out there into the game. It's not considered copying unless you don't acknowledge the other artist. But it is more about influence. A lot of cats will rhyme to the cadence of another artist's song that really got under their skin for some reason. The funny thing about Colors is that the trademark sound, this trippy echo that sounds kind of like church bell on reverb, was something that came out of a machine by mistake. The engineer hit a wrong button in the echo machine and said, "Oh shit, let me wipe it clean." "No," I said. "That's so fucking dope. Put that in the record." It was random, like amp feedback in some old 60s rock records, but it was the sound that people remember most about that track. That weird ringing, echoing sound. Nothing planned, just a fuck-up that we left in the final mix. The thing about that movie, I'll be the first to say it, sure, it was fake. The storyline had the Crips fighting the Mexicans. But to me, that didn't matter too much. A lot of people who get mad at the inauthenticity of Colors don't know the backstory of how the movie got made. Dennis Hopper told me that he wanted to make a movie about gangs, and the movie studio told him he had to set and shoot it in Chicago. Why Chicago, Hopper said. We have gangs in L.A. We have gangs in L.A., an executive said. Hopper told those studio suits that same year there'd been 367 kids killed. That's how invisible the gang culture still was to even L.A. film executives. If you're in Beverly Hills, you don't know the first thing about what's going on down in South Central and Compton. Dennis convinced them to make it about gangs in L.A., but when they decided to go in, I guess they heard how real the banging was between the sets and got really, really afraid of portraying the gang world. They intentionally created something fictionalized, like Crips fighting Mexicans, because they didn't dare show the Crips warring with Bloods. They sidestepped the issue, figuring the movie was toxic enough without them pissing off real sets of Crips and Bloods. If you're from out of town and you don't really know Watts or Compton, it's not too far off base. Of course, gangbangers pick at that movie like they are picking lint out of fly shit. They'll always say, no, it wasn't like that. But I've worked on enough film and TV sets to know this. It would be damn near impossible to make a movie play-by-play on how the gang situation was going down in L.A. What Colors did is make people around the country aware that there was a serious gang scene in L.A. I wasn't in the movie. A lot of people think I acted in it, but I just did the title song and the video. We were nominated for an MTV award for that, too. I think that song still holds up today. I just cared about keeping the song as real as I could from the gangbangers' perspective. That's all I cared about. The song was more real than the movie, to be honest. Call it uncompromising. Call it hard-headed. I thought it was all about artistic integrity. I decided that I wasn't going to do any radio edits of my songs. I mean, I wasn't getting any radio love anyway. My records never got played, so I figured, why should I clean up my lyrics for these suckers? NWA was raw as fuck. When they topped the Billboard album chart, they had to censor the band's full name. But even they started making clean radio versions. I refused flat out. I was really on some rebel shit. I wouldn't compromise my artistic principles. The fact that my records sold well, got RIAA certified gold status without any airplay, and that I was able to earn an income meant, in a sense, that I could afford not to give a fuck. I was real hard. I didn't like going up to radio stations and kissing their ass only to have them still not play my records. I even had a song called Radio Suckers Never Play Me, with a hook I sampled from Chuck D. I was making all my money pretty much selling records and touring. Hip-hop was still like that. You could do it on a street level back in the day. Acts like Master P and Ghetto Boys built these huge, loyal fan bases without radio play, just by doing regional shows and selling their shit on an indie label. Literally selling their tapes out of the trunks of cars and in mom-and-pop record shops. You could get a following out there, but you couldn't be too pop. You had to have a really hard product. Luke and Two Live Crew were selling 1 million copies with each album, and they were selling pretty much all of them down in Florida. It could be done back then. There wasn't an internet, no file sharing or downloading to kill your store sales. Fans had to buy the record, not even CDs sometimes. It was still cassette tapes, and you had to physically own the product. My base was always L.A. first, and New York second, and Detroit was always my third, then Chicago, then Atlanta, but my stuff moved in all the American cities. Overseas, my stuff was always selling steadily, mostly in Germany. They buy the most records.